June 23, 1932, 10:14 p.m., a desolate dirt road outside of Prosper, Texas. The only sound is the rhythmic ticking of a cooling Ford V8 engine and the frantic chirping of crickets that suddenly goes silent. The humidity is a physical weight, smelling of dry earth and spent gasoline. In the middle of the road, a man named Miller is on his knees. His breath comes in ragged, wet gasps. Above him stands Clyde Barrow. The moonlight catches the polished steel of a .45 caliber 1911. Click. The hammer is back. Clyde's eyes aren't filled with rage, they are empty. That's the terrifying part. To Clyde, this isn't personal. It's logistics. Miller was an informant, a leak in the hull of their sinking ship. The barrel of the gun presses into Miller's forehead, leaving a cold circular indentation. "I gave you a coat when you were shivering, Miller," Clyde says, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "I gave you bread, and you gave me the law." Miller's eyes dart to the passenger side of the car. There, leaning against the doorframe, is Bonnie Parker. She's smoking a Camel, the cherry glowing like a dying star in the Texas dark. She doesn't look away. She watches the scene with a detached, poetic melancholy. Just as Clyde's finger begins to tighten on the trigger, Bonnie moves. She walks over, the gravel crunching under her heels, a sound like breaking bones. She leans into Clyde's ear. Her voice is a velvet thread. She whispers 5 words. "He has a daughter, Clyde." Clyde's posture freezes. The tension in the air is so thick it feels like it could shatter. Slowly, agonizingly, Clyde lowers the weapon. He doesn't look at Miller. He looks at Bonnie. To understand how a cold-blooded killer could be swayed by 5 words, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the legends, before the blood, there was only a boy from the slums and a girl who wanted to be a star. But Miller's life wasn't saved out of mercy. It was saved because Bonnie knew something Clyde didn't, and that secret was already catching up to them. 2 years earlier. January 1930, Dallas, Texas. The West Dallas Devil's Back porch was a slum built on mud and desperation. This is where Clyde Barrow learned that the law wasn't a protector. It was an apex predator. The air here smelled of open sewers and cheap gin. Clyde wasn't born a monster. He was a small, slight man with a talent for music and a thirst for something better than the gutter. But the Texas prison system in the 1930s was a factory for ghosts. When Clyde was sent to Eastham Prison Farm, he entered a world of systemic brutality. "Keep your head down, Barrow," an older inmate whispered during a lunch break, his hands scarred from picking cotton under the blistering sun. "The guards here don't want your soul. They just want your back to break." But Clyde's back wouldn't break. Instead, his heart turned to stone. To escape the back-breaking labor, he purposefully chopped off 2 of his own toes with an axe. It was a calculated sacrifice. He traded a part of his body for a moment of peace. While Clyde was bleeding in a prison infirmary, Bonnie Parker was sitting in a cafe writing poems in the margins of a newspaper. She was a waitress with a wedding ring from a man who had disappeared, dreaming of Hollywood and white picket fences. She didn't want a criminal. She wanted a protagonist. When they met at a friend's house in Dallas, it wasn't a spark. It was a forest fire. Bonnie saw the darkness in Clyde and mistook it for depth. Clyde saw the light in Bonnie and used it to find his way out of the shadows. They thought their love was a sanctuary. They didn't realize it was the very thing that would put a target on their backs before the first bank was even robbed. April 1932, Hillsboro, Texas. The plan was simple. Their small grocery store. Quick cash, no one gets hurt. The interior of the store smelled of aged cheddar and floor wax. J.N. Bucher, the store owner, was a man who believed in the honesty of a day's work. When the 2 young men walked in, Clyde and an associate, Bucher didn't see outlaws, he saw customers. "Can I help you, boys?" Bucher asked, reaching for a paper bag. Clyde didn't answer with words. He pulled the gun. The air in the small shop suddenly felt vacuum-sealed. "The register," Clyde commanded. "Now." Bucher hesitated. It wasn't bravery, it was confusion. He reached under the counter, perhaps for a weapon, perhaps just out of reflex. The gun in Clyde's hand barked once. The sound was deafening in the cramped space, followed by the crystalline shatter of a glass display case. Bucher slumped, The smell of gunpowder replaced the scent of groceries. Outside, Bonnie was waiting in the car, the engine idling. She heard the shot. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She had a choice in that moment. She could put the car in gear and disappear into the Texas horizon, leaving the violence behind. Instead, when Clyde ran out, his face pale and eyes wide with the realization of what he'd done, Bonnie opened the door. "Drive," he gasped. She didn't ask questions. She didn't scream. She simply pressed the accelerator. That was the moment the Barrow Gang was truly born. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that there was no going back. The state of Texas now had a dead shopkeeper, and the public wanted blood. But as the manhunt began, the gang was growing, and so was their desperation. May 1932, the backwoods of Oklahoma. The law has a long memory, and in the 1930s, it had a new face: Frank Hamer. Hamer was a retired Texas Ranger, a man who looked like he was carved out of cedar and grit. He didn't care about the Robin Hood image the newspapers were starting to build around Bonnie and Clyde. To him, they were just rabid dogs that needed to be put down. "They aren't legends," Hamer told a room of local deputies, the smoke from his pipe curling like a snake. "They're scared children with high-powered rifles. They move fast, but they leave a trail of spent shells and broken hearts. We don't chase them, we wait for them." Meanwhile, the gang was living out of stolen cars. Their lives were a blur of Ford V8s, dusty highways, and cold cans of beans. They slept with Browning automatic rifles, bars, across their laps. The glamour was gone, replaced by a grinding, exhausting paranoia. Bonnie's leg had been horribly burned in a car accident. Acid from the battery had eaten into her flesh. She could barely walk. Clyde carried her. In the quiet moments, in the damp woods where the owls hooted like mocking spirits, Clyde would dress her wounds. "Why stay, Bonnie?" he asked one night, his voice barely a whisper. "You could surrender. They wouldn't hang a woman." Bonnie looked at him, her eyes reflecting the campfire. "I'd rather be dead with you than alive in a cell, Clyde. We're the same now." This wasn't romance. It was a mutual suicide pact. They were leaning on each other because the rest of the world had become a firing squad. While Hamer was closing the net, a betrayal was brewing within the gang. Someone was tired of running, and the price of their freedom was Bonnie and Clyde's lives. We are back on that road near Prosper. The gun is down, but the air is still electric. Miller is shaking, his face pressed into the dirt. Bonnie's 5 words, "He has a daughter, Clyde," weren't an appeal to Clyde's humanity. They were a reminder of a tactical error. If Miller died here, his brother, a man with deep ties to the police in Louisiana, would stop at nothing to hunt them down. A living informant is a liability, but a martyred one is a death sentence. Clyde understands the subtext. He grabs Miller by the collar and hauls him up. "You have 1 hour to disappear, Miller. If I see your face again, I won't care who your daughter is. I'll bury you in an unmarked hole." Miller runs. He doesn't look back. Bonnie watches him go, then turns to Clyde. "He's going to talk anyway," she says flatly. "I know," Clyde replies, "but it buys us tonight." They get back into the car. The interior is cramped, filled with the smell of Bonnie's perfume and the metallic scent of oiled guns. As they drive away, the headlights cut through the fog like twin blades. They are heading toward Missouri, toward a temporary hideout that they hope will be a sanctuary. Every bank robbery is attributed to them. Every mysterious shooting is blamed on the Barrow Gang. They are becoming giants in the public imagination, which only makes the police more desperate to cut them down to size. In Missouri, they would find a moment of peace, but a single roll of undeveloped film would become their greatest mistake. April 1933, Joplin, Missouri. The apartment on Oak Ridge Drive was supposed to be a place to breathe. They played cards, they drank, and they took photos. These are the famous photos the world knows. Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth, Bonnie leaning on Clyde, the guns displayed like trophies. It was a game of outlaw that became too real. The neighbors grew suspicious. Too many fast cars, too many people, too much noise in the middle of the night. On April 13th, 2 police cars pulled up to the driveway. They weren't there for a shootout. They thought they were investigating bootleggers. The confrontation was instantaneous. Crack boom. The bar in Clyde's hands chewed through the walls of the apartment. Plaster exploded. Glass rained down on the sidewalk. 2 officers fell in the first few seconds. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical roar that drowned out the screams. "Get to the car!" Clyde yelled. They scrambled down the stairs, firing wildly. Bonnie grabbed the jewelry and the cameras, but in the chaos, they left something behind. A camera with an unfinished roll of film. They escaped the Joplin trap, but they left the police a gift. When those photos were developed, they gave the public a face to hate. The pretty girl with the cigar became the ultimate villain of the Depression era. The photos made them famous, but they also made them targets. The FBI was now involved, and the barrow luck was about to run out in a muddy field in Louisiana. May 21st, 1934, Black Lake, Louisiana. The end didn't feel like a finale. It felt like a Tuesday. Bonnie and Clyde were tired. Truly, bone-deep tired. Bonnie's leg was worse, and Clyde was driving on pure adrenaline and caffeine. They stopped at a small cafe to buy sandwiches. Bonnie bought a red dress. She wanted to look nice, maybe she knew. They were headed to meet the family of Henry Methvin, one of their gang members. They thought the Methvins were allies. They didn't know that Henry's father, Ivy, had already made a deal with Frank Hamer. The deal was simple. Ivy's son gets a pardon, and Bonnie and Clyde get an ambush. That night, they camped in the woods. They ate sandwiches and talked about the future, a future that both of them knew was a fantasy. They talked about settling down in Mexico, about changing their names. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Bonnie asked, looking up at the canopy of pines. Clyde cleaned his rifle, the metal clicking rhythmically. "They won't have a choice, Bonnie. We gave them too much to talk about." As they slept, Frank Hamer and 6 heavily armed lawmen were taking their positions behind a thicket of bushes on Highway 154. They weren't planning on making an arrest. May 23rd, 1934, 9:15 a.m., Highway 154, Sales, Louisiana. The morning was bright and clear. The birds were singing. It was a beautiful day for a massacre. Clyde was driving the stolen Ford V8. Bonnie was in the passenger seat, eating a sandwich. They saw Ivy Methvin's truck parked on the side of the road, one of its tires removed as if it were broken down. Clyde, ever loyal to his associates, slowed down. He pulled the car to a stop to help. He never even turned off the engine. Frank Hamer didn't yell, "Freeze." He didn't give a warning. He stood up from the bushes and opened fire. 6 men, armed with automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols, unleashed a wall of lead. The sound was like 1,000 hammers hitting a tin roof at once. The Ford's windows shattered instantly. The metal body of the car was punched through like paper. Clyde was hit in the head in the first burst. He died instantly, his foot slipping off the clutch, causing the car to roll slowly forward into a ditch. Bonnie had enough time to scream, a long, high-pitched wail that was cut short by a hail of bullets. They fired 130 rounds. They kept firing long after the car had stopped moving. They kept firing until the only sound left was the ringing in their ears and the slow drip, drip, drip of oil and blood onto the pavement. The outlaws were dead, but the circus was just beginning. May 23rd, 1934. 11 a.m., the ambush site. Before the bodies were even cold, the crowd arrived. Word spread like wildfire through the Louisiana countryside. People arrived in trucks, on horseback, and on foot. They didn't come to mourn. They came for souvenirs. Men tried to cut off locks of Bonnie's blood-matted hair. One man tried to cut off Clyde's ear. They tore pieces of Bonnie's blood-stained dress. They picked up the shell casings as if they were holy relics. The public had consumed the story of Bonnie and Clyde for years, and now they wanted to own a piece of the ending. When the car was finally towed into town, the bodies were still inside. The Ford looked like a colander. The town of Arcadia became a ghost town turned carnival. The smell of death was everywhere, but so was the smell of popcorn and excitement. Bonnie's mother had once said, "The law killed them, but the people will keep them alive." She was right, but the version the people kept alive wasn't the 2 scared, desperate kids who died in that car. It was a myth. But there was one final detail, one thing that wasn't in the newspapers. The 5 words Bonnie whispered to Clyde years before. They weren't just about a daughter. The dust settled on Highway 154, but the storm was just moving back home. In the end, the law achieved its physical goal, but they failed to kill the idea. Bonnie and Clyde were brought back to Dallas in a morbid procession that looked more like a Roman triumph than a police transport. The funeral was a spectacle of the grotesque. Over 20,000 people swarmed the funeral home where Bonnie lay in her open casket. The air inside smelled of lilies and formaldehyde, mixed with the sweat of the curious. People pushed and shoved just to catch a glimpse of the girl outlaw. They wanted to see if she looked like the poems or like the bullets. Bonnie's family made one final, desperate stand against the legend. They refused to let her be buried next to Clyde. Mrs. Parker, her mother, was adamant. He had her in life, but he won't have her in death. Bonnie was laid to rest in Fishtrap Cemetery. Clyde was placed in Western Heights beside his brother, Buck. They are separated by miles of concrete and the Trinity River. But you can't separate a myth with dirt and headstones. Why do we still talk about them? Because they represent the ultimate jagged rebellion. They emerged during the Great Depression, a time when the American dream had turned into a nightmare of foreclosures and breadlines. When the banks were taking people's homes and the government seemed like a distant, powerless ghost, Bonnie and Clyde took what they wanted. They were violent, they were reckless, and they were doomed. And that tragedy is exactly what made them immortal. And those 5 words. He has a daughter, Clyde. It turns out that moment on the road wasn't just a flash of empathy. It was a cold, strategic investment. Miller's daughter did indeed grow up, but she didn't just become a historian. She became the keeper of the unspoken Barrow history. She found that the mercy shown to her father was Bonnie's most calculated move. She knew that the police would write the official report, but the witnesses, the survivors, would write the legend. By sparing Miller because of his daughter, Bonnie ensured that there was a witness who owed them a debt of blood. She knew that a living man with a story of outlaw grace was more powerful than a dead informant. They didn't just want to survive the night, they wanted to survive the century. The Barrow Gang is gone. The Ford V8, riddled with 167 bullet holes, sits behind glass in a Nevada casino, a morbid monument to the end of an era. But the tension of that dirt road, the metallic click of the hammer, and that velvet whisper in the dark, it lives on every time we tell the tale. They traded their lives for a story that never ends. They chose the fire, and in doing so they ensured they would never grow cold. Bonnie and Clyde were monsters to some, and heroes to others, trapped in a cycle of their own making. But in the end, they were just 2 people who chose a violent path and reached a violent end. The question remains, would you have stayed in that car, knowing how the road ended? Or would you have jumped out when the first shot was fired? Let us know your thoughts on the Barrow legacy in the comments. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows of history. The truth is always darker than the legend.